And so, yeah, I mean, I'm here to talk about sort of bar exam essay writing. I've been doing sort of bar preparation since the time I graduated from law school myself in 1999, 2000. Seems so long ago. Bar exam preparation is something that I just love, and to indicate just the love that I have for bar exam preparation. My car, my little Hyundai Kona has a license plate of bar exam, so whenever I drive down the street, they know not to mess with me because they know they're dealing with a professor, and they know they're dealing with someone whose first love is the bar exam. So why don't we go ahead and just jump right into this? There's a lot of information here, but what I wanted to do is just give you a flavor of sort of my teaching technique, my style, while also sort of giving you some valuable tips and advice on how to really write sort of winning and strong uh, essay responses for the bar exam. So let me just go ahead and just lay the land just real quickly, and I'll just do this real quickly too. So currently, there's sort of three columns here in this chart. You'll see in the world of bar exam, we're sort of in this transition period between sort of the current bar exam and the next gen bar exam. And I understand that you'll get a little bit more information about the next gen bar exam. But the unique nature about this isn't sort of the adoption of the next gen bar exam, but really sort of that transition period where the current bar exam is being phased out at the same time that the new bar exam, the next gen bar exam, is being rolled in. And so there's almost a 2-year period where there's going to be sort of these two different bar exams at the same time. And so depending on when you take the bar exam is going to sort of reflect what subjects you're going to sort of have to focus on for the essay portion. So with the current uniform bar exam, which is the current bar exam offered in District of Columbia, you'll see it in the first column with the uniform bar exam. That's the current. And the District of Columbia is not going to transition to the next gen bar exam until February 2028. So just in terms of time frame, for instance, if you're taking the bar exam, say between July 26 and February 2028, then you're really looking at this middle column. And really what's happening is that they're trying to make the current bar exam content, the subjects tested on the current bar exam, sort of in line with the next gen bar exam. So you can sort of see some of those subjects that are going to sort of fall off of the bar exam during this transition period. Okay. Now with that context, let me just go ahead and just dive into bar exam essay writing. And I may be different from maybe some other professors or what you've heard about essay writing generally, but I'm going to sort of talk about the CIRAC structure. Sometimes you may hear things as IRAC or other sort of derivations, but I like to follow a CIRAC format, and we'll dive into each one of these sections of a proper bar exam essay as we go through this session in the next 16 or 17 minutes or so. But what I encourage students to do is to begin with a conclusion, identify the issue, include sort of a rule section that includes not just the broad rule, but also more specific rules. And then sort of the meat of the essay is the application. And then you wrap it up with basically the same conclusion that you started with. The Control C, Control V, basically highlight that first sentence, move the cursor down, and just plop it in at the end. Now, I follow CIREC. Now, I will say, like I said, there's a lot of different sort of variations of this format. I prefer CIREC, but let me just sort of give you sort of some indication of what the bar examiners want, and really what the bar examiners, I'll give this as sort of a small type of example. University of Dayton, located in the state of Ohio. Ohio releases some selected answers to pass bar exam essays. And so in one year where they released selected answers, one answer followed what I'm going to be talking about today, the C-IRAC format. Another answer that they released to another question during that same examination followed a C-RAC or a crack format, and still another selected answer that Ohio released, and this is the February 2023 exam, follows the more sort of traditional sort of IRAC format. So there's no one specific format that examiners prefer, although you can sort of see the similarities. The meat, where the most points are going to come from, are actually the R and the A, the rules and the analysis or the application. Okay. Now I prefer, again, that students, that examinees, that graduates use C-IRAC. And I think it's really important to begin with that conclusion sentence, because in the grand scheme of things, most of the essays are going to be designed to be read and written in 30 minutes. And you can imagine that in a sort of very short time span that is very high intense, high stress, that a lot of times what you think you wrote on paper isn't necessarily what you actually did write on paper. And so by including a conclusion statement up top, really what you're doing is that you're giving the reader, the grader, the professor a heads up in terms of how you're going to resolve that issue. And to quote Eminem, right? You only get one shot. Okay, again, from sort of Lose Yourself. And so you only get one shot, and so you want to be able to include that outcome, that conclusion in the beginning to help the reader sort of follow. Because what that does is that if the reader is a little bit confused about what comes later in the essay, they at least know how you're eventually going to end up, and that can aid in the writing. So let's talk about the conclusion statement then, right? And so obviously when we're talking about the conclusion statement, you want to answer the call of the question. Bar exam essays generally have sort of a, maybe a page, half page fact pattern that ends with the call of the question. And we'll go through some examples there. And in terms of essay writing, bar exam essay writing, I'm a big fan of just really boring, methodical, structured, organized responses, and just really having sort of just that muscle memory approach of writing a structured response. And so what you want to do is use the same language as the call of the question. The call of the question is that sort of interrogatory. It's that question. It's that call to action that's at the end of the essay. And you don't need to provide a rationale for it, because any rationale that you're going to use to support your conclusion necessarily should be in your analysis anyway. So let's just go through some examples here. It doesn't really matter sort of what the law is here. This is secured transactions, which is not going to be tested later on. It's a subject that's being taken off, but I'm just using these as sort of vehicles of explaining sort of the different components of C-IRAC. And so let's just assume that the answer to all of these calls of the questions are yes. So does the bank have an enforceable security interest in the portable welding machine? A good sort of conclusion statement would be something like the bank has an enforceable security interest in the portable welding machine. Again, really just mimicking, right, the call of the question. Again, you got 30 minutes. You got to write fast. That's simple. That's easy. Does the company have any claim against the bank with respect to the sale of the gramophone? And again, let's just assume that the answer is yes. You can imagine that the conclusion statement is going to be something like, the company has a claim against the bank with respect to the sale of the gramophone. Again, you're answering that question using the same exact words, being methodical, and you're really not even sort of thinking about and wasting time trying to figure out how to word or to articulate the conclusion. It's basically given to you in the call of the question, and just rephrase it, and you don't need sort of any rationale or anything for that. Now, let's move on to I, okay? The statement of the issue. And you may be thinking, well, the issue is actually given to you, right? Does the bank have an enforceable security interest in the portable welding machine? That's the issue. The issue is sort of that question given to you at the end of the essay question. But I'm going to challenge you and say, no, 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 that is not a good issue statement. And so really sort of the better issue statement is what I call a narrow issue statement. It's not a regurgitation, it's not a repetition, it's not a duplication of the call of the question. But really what you want to think about is, well, what is that dispositive concept, element, factor that really turns the question, right? So again, sort of using those same calls of the question that we looked at on the prior slide and thinking about drafting a narrow issue statement. Does the bank have an enforceable security interest in the portable welding machine, right? I'm a very sort of visual person. I like to see what's good, what's bad. Let's look at the bad, right? So bad is at issue is whether the bank has an enforceable security agreement in the portable welding machine. Well, that's bad because really all you're doing is just copying the call of the question that's given to you, right? That's not very sort of uh, insightful. So a better issue statement might be at issue is whether the bank security interest attached or whether it's perfected or anything like that. Again, I'm not expecting you to know the law here, but the key point here is sort of think about creating an issue statement that goes to the heart of the answer rather than just mimicking the call of the question. Another example, does the company have any claim against the bank with respect to the sale of the gramophone? I'm gonna yawn here because this is boring. At issue is whether the company has any claim against the bank with respect to the sale of the gramophone. I mean, look, my 10-year-old could write that down. I mean, it's not impressive. So the better thing is at issue is whether a secured party may dispose of collateral after the debtor's default without first notifying the debtor. And again, I don't expect you to know the law, but I think sort of the illustration here, sort of think about an issue statement that goes beyond what's provided to you and have something a little bit more specific. And to highlight this point too, right? So, previously, I gave sort of the rapper Eminem sort of his due. Now let me go ahead and put sort of, 90s country pop star Shania Twain here. If you're not familiar with her, she came out with a song with like that don't impress me much. And if you have the conclusion and the issue statement sort of regurgitating the call of the question, then really your first two sentences is the bank has an enforceable security interest in the portable welding machine. At issue is whether the bank has an enforceable security interest in the portable welding machine. Not very interesting. That's not impressive. That's not going to impress Shania Twain. So, and again, I know I'm aging myself with 90s sort of country pop stars. But look, everyone knows Darth Vader. And so this is, I say more, technically that's right, because there's only two comparisons, but let's just say it's most impressive, right? The bank has an enforceable security interest in the portable welding machine. At issue is whether the bank security interest attached, okay? So conclusion, issue, where does that take us now? That takes us down to the rule. We're halfway there. We're halfway through CIRAC. So let's look at the rule. You want to include the rule statement, which I sort of think about as sort of the broad rule. Then you want to be able to define, explain some of those more relevant factors or elements or concepts within that main rule. So think about a rule statement. Again, don't expect you to know the law, but the battery, at least in this particular case, is tort battery. Battery is the intent to create a harmful or offensive contact to plaintiff's person. And in fact, a harmful or offensive contact did occur. That's a great rule statement, but it needs to go a little bit deeper, right? Because if you're trying to establish what a battery is, you may need to define, how do you establish intent? How do you define a harmful or offensive contact? What, in fact, is a contact to plaintiff's person? And so not only do you want the rule statement, you want a rule explanation that sort of further defines that. And so you can imagine here, battery is the intent. Next part of the rule would explain intent. Intent can be established by specific or general intent. And then maybe you want to go in a little bit more and describe, how do you define specific intent? How do you define general intent? Now, one of the things that you want to do when you create that rule statement is that you want to stay away from specific facts in your rule section. So you don't want to say something like a security interest attaches when the big bank transfers value to Bob, right? You have specific people there, big bank, Bob, in the rule section. You don't want to do that. You want to be general, right? You want to think about your rule section in an essay as something that you can copy and paste and put it in another essay. Okay. And so that's why instead of saying big bank, you can say secured party. Instead of Bob, use something generic like debtor. Again, you can be, sort of general on whatever rule. For instance, if you're talking about battery, you may want to use plaintiff instead of Jimmy Bob. Okay. And I don't know why I just mentioned Jimmy Bob. Bob's there. So, okay. Just maybe one final thing about the rules section. I think a lot of times students on essays feel the need to include all of their knowledge, right? And you don't want to do that on a bar exam essay. Why? Number one, you only have 30 minutes to read, outline, and write your response. So you don't need to define or discuss everything you know. You just want to make sure that you only include the relevant facts and the relevant rules that are necessary to examine those facts. And so here, really what this is showing is what, unfortunately, sometimes examinees do, and that's to rule dump. Okay, you don't want to dump your knowledge on the page. A lot of that stuff's going to be irrelevant, and it just takes too much time. Getting closer to the end of CIREC, and now here is the application. Sometimes you'll hear it as analysis, right? Nicely, they both start with A, application or analysis. And this is where you're applying rules to the facts. And one of the things that you want to think about, this is where the bulk of the points are going to come from. Okay, when you think about an essay as being maybe 100 points, think about the rules section as perhaps being 40%. Think about the application section being, around sort of 60%. And if you're doing the math, that's 100%. Well, what about the C and the I? You're not going to get a lot of credit for the C and I, but it just really packages the discussion really nicely. So you want to really use the because. Like, the first element is met because then you explain why. There's a duty because the party made a valid offer. We're talking about contracts. Because there was value given, going back to this secure transaction example. Because actual authority was not present, if you want to answer in the negative. Because, right? Again, bar exam, I think some of the best bar exam responses are just very methodical and, dare I say, boring. Okay. And so really the structure that you're really looking at is sort of adding some rule that you're trying to establish in that first blank, adding the link because, and then identifying some facts after the word because that sort of links back to establishing sort of the element, concept, or whatever. Again, I'm a visual person where methodically, let's just say you have a rule of law. that has four different factors, four different elements, four different requirements, and you just want to be methodical that you're answering each one. But unfortunately, what I see a lot is sort of this spaghetti mess where perhaps they have a complete rule section, but their analysis or application section is just not methodical or systematic in ensuring that each element is established. And obviously, what you're doing after your application is ending it with the same conclusion, basically wrapping everything up, which is sort of a nice segue here as I'm a little bit over time or at time trying to wrap things up too. But let me just sort of leave you off with this. Just some ways where you can maximize your essay score. So obviously you want to start with the end. I know that sometimes that just sounds counterintuitive, but you want to read the call of the question first because that will tell you sort of what to focus on. If the call of the question is something like, is the defendant liable for assault, for instance, basically then what you're saying then is, okay, I know I'm focusing assault. Let me think about the elements of assault. And that's number two, question the question, right? What are the elements of assault? It's the intent to create a reasonable apprehension, okay, of an imminent harmful or offensive contact. So as you read the fact pattern, then you can think about those different things to think about. So these are sort of the 6 steps to maximize your essay score. I do teach evidence in the Korean program, and as Margaret said previously, I do teach Crim Law, Crim Pro, as well as civil procedure in the LL.M program. Some of the exercises that I do during these classes is that we'll go through an essay, and I'll just go through these real quickly, but we'll just sort of dissect the essay. For instance, I was saying, read the call of the question first, think about the rule. The rules for relevance are on these slides. Then you would dissect the fact pattern, and then think about what are some more relevant rules. Think about some template language that you include in your rule regarding relevancy. Think about following CIRAC, and then, you can sort of see here how I'm encouraging sort of a visual sort of view of what a good CIRAC response is. So I try to incorporate a lot of essay writing practice in all my classes, just because as D. Smith said previously, the writing part is 50% of the current bar exam. And there's also, even with the next gen bar exam, there's a significant amount of writing on that exam as well. So with that, I appreciate everyone's time, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up in the chat or anything later on. So thank you very much.